Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a massive, sometimes intimidating set of economic principles and breaking them down into a single, crystal clear journey. You know, economics really isn't just about stock tickers or distant government boardrooms. At its core, it's the study of how we make choices in a world where things are scarce. So we're going to unpack the invisible forces that shape your wallet, your career, and the global markets, all through some foundational concepts.
Let's kick things off with the ultimate question. Who is actually pulling the strings in our economy? Is it the government, the big banks, or is it everyday people like you and me? It's a question that dominates headlines and political debates every single day. The truth is, it's a super complex web of interactions, and to truly understand who controls those levers, we've got to break down the fundamental mechanics at play.
To figure that out, we need to look through two totally different lenses. Think of microeconomics like a microscope. It zooms right in on the individual actors. That's you deciding what groceries to buy, or a local business deciding what to sell. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, is like a telescope. It zooms all the way out to examine the massive, economy-wide ripples that happen when millions of those individual decisions collide. We're talking big picture stuff here, like inflation, unemployment, and overall economic growth.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, thinking like an economist. Second, supply, demand, and markets. Third, government limits and taxes. Fourth, measuring the whole economy. And finally, money, inflation, and policy. We'll start with individual daily choices and zoom all the way out to global policies.
All right, Section 1, Thinking like an economist. Understanding the economy has to begin with the smallest unit out there, an individual making a choice.
Economists look at literally every single decision you make as a trade-off. Why? Because of scarcity. Our resources are limited, but our desires definitely aren't. When you choose to spend an hour studying, the opportunity cost is the hour you could have spent working or just relaxing. It's whatever you have to give up to get something else. Every action has a cost, even if no actual money changes hands. That simple, powerful concept is the absolute bedrock of all economic theory.
Moving right along to Section 2, Supply, Demand, and Markets. Let's see what happens when those individual choices start building into a larger web of interaction.
Let's imagine a classic scenario with Frank the farmer and Ruby the rancher. Now let's say Ruby is just flat out faster at producing both meat and potatoes than Frank is. She has an absolute advantage. But here is the kicker. Trade still makes perfect sense for both of them. Because Frank gives up less meat to grow an ounce of potatoes than Ruby does, his opportunity cost for potatoes is lower. If they both specialize in what they give up the least to produce, their total combined output actually goes up. Basically, they both win big when they trade.
That whole dynamic right there, that is comparative advantage. It's the absolute driving force behind specialization, making sure markets allocate resources to whoever can produce things most efficiently. And the reason this is so crucial is that it doesn't just apply to Frank and Ruby. It's the exact same principle that dictates why nations trade globally. It perfectly explains how a free society coordinates incredibly diverse, complex activities without needing some central planner dictating everything.
Okay, Section 3, Government Limits and Taxes. Let's swap that microscope for a magnifying glass and see what happens when the government steps into the mix.
It turns out even the most well-intentioned policies can have some serious unintended consequences. When governments dictate a maximum price, like rent control, it's totally meant to help tenants out. But what actually happens, it artificially suppresses the supply of housing while boosting the demand for it, creating long lines and painful housing shortages. On the flip side, a price floor, like the minimum wage, is designed to help low-wage workers. But by legally enforcing a wage above the natural market equilibrium, the quantity of labor supplied outpaces the demand for it. And that surplus of labor, we usually just call that unemployment.
Then there's taxation. Whenever a tax drops into the market, it essentially drives a wedge right between buyers and sellers. The price the buyers have to pay goes up, and the money the sellers actually get to keep goes down. That wedge means fewer goods are sold overall. We call this dead weight loss. It represents economic value that is simply destroyed. These are mutually beneficial trades that Frank and Ruby totally would have made but didn't, just because the tax made the transaction unprofitable.
All right, Section 4, Measuring the whole economy. Time to pull out the telescope. How in the world do we take billions of daily transactions and boil them down into something we can track?
Well, we use gross domestic product, or GDP. That is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a specific time. Get this, in 2021, a massive 68% of the enormous U.S. economy was driven entirely by everyday consumer spending. We're talking about people just buying groceries, getting haircuts, and upgrading their smartphones. Investment and government purchases made up the rest, with net exports sitting slightly negative simply because the U.S. imports more than it exports.
$69,386. That was the U.S. GDP per person back in 2021. Economists use this number as a rough proxy to measure our overall standard of living, showing the average income and expenditure for a citizen that year. As a general rule, nations with a higher GDP per capita tend to have better healthcare, stronger educational systems, and just a higher material standard of living across the board.
But here's the catch. GDP is absolutely not a perfect measure of true human well-being. It strictly measures market value. Think about it. If you take a day off to relax, GDP technically goes down. If you volunteer or stay home to raise your kids, all that productive, meaningful work is totally invisible to GDP. And if a factory churns out goods but heavily pollutes the local river in the process, GDP counts the goods as a win, but completely ignores the environmental damage. As a famous quote points out, it basically measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile.
Which brings us to our final section: money, inflation, and policy. Let's talk about the actual fuel that runs this entire economic machine: money.
Did you know banks literally create money out of thin air? Seriously, it's called fractional reserve banking. When you deposit, say, $100, the bank keeps a small required reserve, maybe $10, and loans out the remaining $90. That $90 then gets spent, deposited into another bank, and loaned out again. Through this incredible multiplier effect, a single $100 deposit can generate $1,000 in the overall money supply. It's wild.
But if a central bank prints too much of that money, the value of the dollar drops. This quietly eats away at your purchasing power without a single tax bill ever showing up in your mailbox. We call this the inflation tax. If the money supply doubles but the actual amount of real goods stays exactly the same, well, prices eventually have to double to balance things out. It acts as a totally hidden tax, punishing anyone holding cash because those dollars just buy fewer goods today than they did yesterday.
And trying to fix that inflation, it is painfully hard. In fact, there's a concept called the sacrifice ratio, which estimates that a nation has to sacrifice a full 5% of a year's output just to knock inflation down by a single percentage point. To fight inflation, a central bank literally has to hit the brakes on the economy, reducing the money supply and jacking up interest rates. In the short run, this cooling off period leads to falling output and rising unemployment. It is super harsh medicine to cure a very dangerous economic fever.
So how do policymakers steer the economy away from the edge? They basically pull on two massive levers. First, the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy, adjusting interest rates and the money supply to either speed up or slow down aggregate demand. Meanwhile, the government uses fiscal policy, tweaking its own spending and tax rates. Both levers aim to stabilize the economy, for sure, but they both suffer from super long implementation lags. So sometimes they're trying to hit a moving target and can accidentally destabilize things even further.
The legendary economist Milton Friedman summed up this whole dynamic perfectly when he said, "There is always a temporary trade-off between inflation and unemployment. There is no permanent trade-off." It's a brilliant insight into the Phillips curve. In the short run, pumping money into the economy makes everyone feel richer. We buy more, businesses hire more, and unemployment drops. But over time, reality sets in. People realize their money buys less, workers demand higher wages to compensate, and unemployment just drifts right back to its natural rate, leaving us with nothing but higher prices.
We've covered a lot of ground today, seeing how tiny micro decisions about opportunity costs ripple all the way up into massive macro forces like GDP, inflation, and government policy. Understanding these dynamics is like getting the cheat code to see the invisible levers shaping our world. So I want to leave you with this thought. As our economy faces huge global supply shocks and unprecedented policy shifts, are we actually finding stability, or are we simply creating tomorrow's imbalances today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.